The evening rush at Bellini's restaurant had begun, and the dining room hummed with the gentle clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation. Through the organized chaos, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun moved between tables with the grace of someone who had learned to navigate crowded spaces without drawing attention to herself. Elena had been working at Bellini's for nearly 2 years now. At 28, she wasn't where she had imagined she would be at this point in her life. The crisp black uniform with its slightly too tight collar wasn't what she had dreamed of wearing. But dreams, as her grandmother used to say, don't pay the bills. "Excuse me, could we get some water over here?" called a man from table 12, not bothering to look up from his menu as Elena passed by. "Right away, sir," she answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. Bellini's wasn't just any restaurant. It sat in the heart of downtown, its warm lighting and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere that justified the prices on the menu. The owners had built the restaurant's reputation on 2 things: excellent Italian cuisine and live music. The centerpiece of the dining room was a glossy black grand piano on a small raised platform. Visible from every table, Elena balanced 4 plates along her arm, delivering them to a family celebrating a birthday. The youngest child, a girl of about 7, looked up at her with wide eyes. "How do you carry so many things without dropping them?" the little girl asked in wonder. Elena winked at her. "Lots of practice. And a little bit of magic." This made the child giggle, and for a moment Elena felt a genuine smile warm her face. These small connections were rare bright spots in long shifts that often blurred together. After clearing another table, Elena took a moment to glance at her watch. Her feet ached, and she still had 4 hours to go before she could pick up her son Matteo from her neighbor's apartment. The elderly woman never complained about watching him during Elena's evening shifts, but Elena hated imposing. Matteo was a good boy who deserved more of his mother's time than she could give. Near the piano, tonight's musician was setting up. He was new, a young man with fashionable glasses and an air of importance that seemed too big for the modest venue. Elena approached him with a glass of water, the standard offering for performers. "Water for you," she said, setting it down on a small table beside the piano bench. "Kitchen can make you something to eat during your break if you'd like." The pianist barely glanced at her. "I'll need sparkling water, not tap. And make sure there's lemon in it." "Real lemon, not that packaged juice?" Elena nodded, used to these requests. Musicians came and went at Bellini's, some kind, some dismissive, most somewhere in between. To them, she was just part of the furnishings, as functional and unremarkable as the tables she cleaned. "Of course," she replied, taking back the regular water. As she headed toward the kitchen, she heard the first notes of the piano. The musician was warming up with a piece she recognized immediately, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Her steps slowed involuntarily, and for just a second her fingers twitched at her sides, muscle memory responding to music that once flowed through them. The kitchen doors swung open as she pushed through, the cacophony of clattering pots and sizzling pans replacing the delicate piano notes. Carlos, the head chef, shouted orders in a mix of English and Spanish while line cooks moved in a synchronized dance around the hot stoves. "Elena, Table 9 has been waiting for their check for 10 minutes. Her manager, Rick, stood by the service station. His perpetually worried expression deepened by the Friday night rush. "I'm sorry. I'll take care of it right away," she said, quickly placing the water glass in the dish bin and grabbing a sparkling water for the pianist. Rick sighed. "And Liza called in sick, so I need you to cover her section too." Elena's heart sank. Covering an extra section meant staying later, and Mrs. Patel couldn't watch Matteo past 11. "I can't stay past my shift, Rick. I don't have childcare." "I'm sorry, but we're slammed and there's nobody else," Rick said, already moving on to solve the next crisis. Figure something out. The story of her life. Elena had been figuring things out since she was 16, when her parents' car spun off an icy road and never reached home. She'd figured out how to finish high school while working part-time. She'd figured out how to get into the conservatory on scholarship. She'd figured out how to raise Matteo when his father decided fatherhood wasn't for him. She pulled out her phone and texted Mrs. Patel, asking if she could possibly watch Matteo until midnight, promising extra payment. The 3 dots appeared immediately. Her neighbor was a night owl who understood Elena's situation all too well. "No problem, dear. He's already asleep on my couch. Take your time." Relief washed over her. She tucked her phone away and grabbed the check for table 9, plastering on her professional smile once more. The pianist had begun his official set now, his fingers moving competently across the keys. He was good, technically proficient and confident. But as Elena delivered the sparkling water with lemon, she couldn't help noticing the way he played the Chopin piece. All technique, little feeling. The notes were perfect, but the soul was missing. Not that the diners noticed. They were enjoying the ambiance, the music creating the perfect backdrop for their expensive meals and important conversations. At table 14 sat 4 men and 2 women in business attire, their voices carrying just a bit too loudly across the restaurant. They'd been drinking expensive wine for an hour, celebrating some corporate success. "Another bottle of the Barolo," one of the men called out as Elena passed by. "Certainly, sir." She noted the slight slur in his words, making a mental note to keep an eye on their table. As the night progressed, the corporate table grew louder. Elena managed their needs efficiently, even as their behavior became more demanding. When she brought their 3rd bottle of wine, one of the men looked up at her with the glassy eyes of someone well past their limit. "You ever get tired of serving people like us?" he asked, his tone somewhere between genuine curiosity and condescension. Elena maintained her professional smile. "It's my pleasure to ensure you have a good evening." A woman at the table laughed. "Come on, nobody dreams of being a waitress. What did you want to be when you grew up?" The question, though probably not intended to be cruel, hit a tender spot. Elena felt her cheeks warm as the table's attention focused on her. "I wanted to be many things," she answered diplomatically. "More wine, anyone?" "She's avoiding the question," another man chimed in. "Let me guess, actress? They all want to be actresses." Elena efficiently refilled their glasses, the practice of thousands of similar motions allowing her to appear calm, while discomfort twisted in her stomach. These people saw a waitress, someone who existed to serve them, whose life story could be a brief entertainment during their meal before being forgotten entirely. What would they think if they knew she had once performed at Carnegie Hall as part of a young artist's showcase? That she had been accepted to a master's program she never got to attend? That the same hands that now carried their plates and poured their wine had once made music that brought audiences to their feet? But those were thoughts for quiet moments, not for the middle of a busy shift. Elena excused herself from the table and continued her rounds, checking on other diners, clearing plates, bringing fresh bread. The work was physically demanding but required little mental engagement, leaving her mind free to wander as her body went through the familiar motions. She thought about Matteo, who would be starting 2nd grade soon. He had her eyes and musical ear, but his father's easy smile. He'd been asking for piano lessons, unaware of the irony of his mother scraping together tips to pay someone else to teach him what she could have taught him herself. If only they had a piano at home. The night continued its predictable rhythm. The corporate table finally paid their substantial bill, leaving a tip that was generous but not remarkable given their tab. The pianist finished his set and packed up without acknowledging the staff. Couples lingered over dessert and coffee, while Elena and the other servers began the closing routine, refilling salt shakers and replacing candles. As the dining room emptied, Elena found herself near the piano. The lid had been closed, the bench tucked neatly underneath. Everyone was busy with closing tasks, and for a moment, she was alone in this corner of the restaurant. Her hand reached out, almost of its own accord, and touched the polished surface of the piano. Cool and smooth, it felt both familiar and foreign beneath her fingertips. How long had it been since she'd really played? Not the occasional Christmas carol on the electronic keyboard she'd bought for Matteo, but really played, losing herself in the music. 5 years at least, before Matteo started school, before the second job, before exhaustion became her constant companion. "You play?" Rick's voice startled her and she pulled her hand back as if caught doing something forbidden. "No," she said quickly, just admiring it. "It's a beautiful instrument." Rick nodded absently, already moving on to his next task. "Make sure the salt and pepper shakers are full before you clock out." Elena nodded, turning away from the piano. This wasn't the time or place for regrets or what-ifs. She had a good job. 2 good jobs, actually, with her weekend work at the supermarket. She had a healthy son, a roof over their heads, and if their apartment was small and the neighborhood noisy, well, it was still home. As she finished her closing duties and changed out of her uniform in the cramped employee restroom, Elena caught her reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes looked back at her, but they were still bright with something that hadn't quite been extinguished by years of practical concerns. Maybe someday, she whispered to her reflection, a habit she'd developed for dreams that seemed too fragile to speak aloud to anyone else. Outside, the night air was cool against her skin as she began the walk to the bus stop. Tomorrow would bring another day, another shift, another opportunity to keep moving forward. And if sometimes her fingers tapped out piano concertos on her thigh while she rode the bus home, well, that was her secret to keep. The week had crawled by for Elena. Extra shifts at the supermarket, Mateo's parent-teacher conference, and a leaky faucet that required 3 trips to the hardware store had left her exhausted. Friday evening arrived with the promise of a busy night at Bellini's, which meant good tips if she could keep up with the pace. "You look tired," observed Diane, an older waitress who had taken Elena under her wing when she first started. They stood in the cramped break room, tying their aprons and checking their appearance in the small mirror by the lockers. Mateo had a cold. "Neither of us got much sleep," Elena replied, dabbing concealer under her eyes. "But I'm fine." Diane gave her a knowing look. "You always say that." Before Elena could respond, Rick burst into the break room, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mix of panic and irritation. "We have a problem," he announced to the room at large. "Paul just called in sick. No pianist tonight." The other servers exchanged glances. Friday nights at Bellini's were known for live music. Many reservations were made specifically for the combination of fine dining and entertainment. "Can't you call someone else?" asked Diane. Rick ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I've tried everyone on our list. It's too last minute." He checked his watch. "First reservations start arriving in 20 minutes. We'll just have to tell people there's no music tonight." "The Harrington party isn't going to be happy," muttered one of the bartenders. "They reserved the large table specifically for the client dinner with music." Elena thought of the grand, piano sitting silent in the dining room, empty, waiting, something twisted in her stomach, an old longing she usually managed to keep buried beneath practicality. "What about recorded music?" she suggested quietly. Rick shook his head. "Not the same. People pay for the experience." He sighed heavily. "Let's just focus on making the food and service exceptional tonight, all right? Everyone on your A game." The staff dispersed to their stations, and Elena headed out to the dining room to prepare her tables. As she arranged silverware and folded napkins, her eyes kept drifting to the piano. In the soft lighting, it looked almost like it was holding its breath, an instrument meant to sing forced into silence. By 7 o'clock, the restaurant was filling up. Elena moved efficiently between tables, taking orders, delivering food, refilling water glasses. The absence of music was noticeable. Conversation seemed louder, the clink of dishes more pronounced. Several patrons had already asked about the pianist. Harrington party arrived at 7:30. 8 well-dressed business people led by a man with silver hair and an air of authority that commanded attention as soon as he entered. Elena wasn't assigned to their table, but she noticed the way Rick personally escorted them to the large round table near the piano, apologizing profusely for the absence of music. "You promised us the full Bellini's experience," the silver-haired man said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "My clients came specifically for dinner and music." "I understand, Mr. Harrington, and we're deeply sorry," Rick apologized. "Our pianist fell ill unexpectedly. We'll certainly comp your appetizers and offer a discount on the final bill." Mr. Harrington didn't look appeased, but he and his party took their seats. Elena continued with her work, trying not to eavesdrop, but their voices carried. "We should have gone to Vincenzo's," one woman in a crimson blazer said. "Their string quartet never disappoints." "Well, we're here now," replied another man, "though I was looking forward to some Gershwin with my steak." Elena delivered bruschetta to a couple celebrating their anniversary when she heard a commotion from the Harrington table. Their server, a college student named Josh who was relatively new, looked flustered as he backed away from the table, a dark stain spreading across his white shirt. "I asked for sparkling water." "Not still," the man in the gray suit said coldly. "And now look what's happened." "I'm so sorry, sir," Josh stammered. "I'll bring you sparkling water right away and get something to clean this up." Elena quickly finished with her table and intercepted Josh as he rushed toward the kitchen. "What happened?" she asked. "Mr. Gray Suit is having a bad day, apparently," Josh said, his face red with embarrassment. He accidentally knocked his water onto me when I brought the wrong kind. Go change your shirt, Elena told him. I'll handle the table for a minute. Josh gave her a grateful look before hurrying to the break room. Elena grabbed a towel and a fresh glass of sparkling water before approaching the Harrington table. Pardon me, she said politely. Josh is changing his shirt. I brought your sparkling water, sir, and I'll clean up the spill. The man barely acknowledged her as she placed the water down and began dabbing at the puddle on the table. The conversation around her continued as if she were invisible. So boring without music, the woman in crimson commented. This place had better live up to the food reviews at least. Maybe they could have one of the staff perform, joked a younger man with a loud laugh. Hey, what about you? He turned to Elena, who was still cleaning the spill. Do you sing? Heat rushed to Elena's cheeks as several pairs of eyes turned toward her. I'm afraid not, sir, she answered quietly. Too bad, the man continued, clearly enjoying having an audience. That would have at least been entertaining. Maybe the waitress could play us a tune. He gestured toward the piano with his wine glass. A ripple of laughter moved around the table. Not cruel exactly, but dismissive, the kind of laughter that came easily to people who had never worried about making rent or choosing between new school shoes and a winter coat. Imagine that, the woman in crimson said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. From serving plates to serving Chopin. More laughter followed. Elena finished cleaning the spill, her movements mechanical as she tried to ignore the burning in her cheeks and the tightness in her throat. I'll send Josh back with your appetizers soon, she said, forcing her voice to remain professional as she backed away from the table. In the kitchen, she took a deep breath, centering herself. This was nothing new. Customers sometimes treated servers as if they were one-dimensional beings who existed solely to bring food and disappear. It shouldn't bother her, but tonight it did. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was the silent piano. Perhaps it was the memory of that same piece of Chopin they had casually mentioned. The nocturne in E-flat major she had once played at her final recital at the conservatory, her fingers bringing out nuances that had made her instructor weep. Elena shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She had tables to serve, customers waiting. Dreams and memories didn't pay the bills. The evening progressed, the restaurant now completely full. The Harrington table grew louder with each bottle of wine, their laughter and conversation dominating the dining room. Twice more they made comments as Elena passed, not directly to her, but loud enough for her to hear. I still think it would have been funny to see the staff attempt to entertain us. Maybe they could do a little dance instead, or juggle the desserts. Each comment landed like a small stone, not heavy enough to wound deeply, but accumulating over time. During a rare quiet moment, Elena found herself standing near the piano again. The dining room was buzzing with conversation, the kitchen was slammed with orders, and Rick looked like he might collapse from stress at any moment. The absence of music had created a void that couldn't be filled with just food and wine, no matter how excellent. She glanced at the Harrington table. They were between courses, some checking phones, others engaged in conversation that continued to carry across the room. Mr. Harrington himself was explaining something to his clients, gesturing emphatically. Just need someone with the proper training. Can't expect results otherwise. Something shifted inside Elena, a quiet rebellion against years of pushing herself into smaller and smaller spaces to accommodate others' expectations and assumptions. She thought of Mateo, who'd asked her just last week why she never played the big piano like the people in the videos they sometimes watched together. Because that's not my job. Sweetheart, she had told him. But why wasn't it? Or rather, why couldn't it be even for one night? Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena walked over to Rick, who was studying the reservation list with a furrowed brow. Rick, she said quietly, I could play. He looked up distracted. What? The piano, Elena clarified, her heart pounding. I could play it. For a little while. Rick stared at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. You play piano? Like actually play? Not just chopsticks or heart and soul? I studied at the conservatory, she said, the words feeling strange after so long. For 3 years. Before I had Mateo. Rick's expression shifted from confusion to cautious hope. Are you serious? Why didn't you ever mention this? Elena shrugged. It never came up. Can you? Rick gestured toward the piano. I mean, would you be willing to play now? Just a few pieces? The Harrington party is getting restless, and we could really use the music. Elena nodded slowly. I'd need to change. I can't play in this uniform. Rick's face broke into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all night. There's a black dress in Lost and Found. Been there for months. Might fit you. He hesitated. Are you sure about this? Was she? Elena wasn't certain. But something was pulling her toward that piano with a force she hadn't felt in years. I'm sure, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. As she hurried to the break room, a mixture of terror and exhilaration flooded through her. What was she thinking? She hadn't performed in public for 5 years. Her skills would be rusty, her confidence shaken. But as she slipped into the simple black dress, which fit well enough, though a bit loose in the shoulders, another thought surfaced. This was who she had been before life took its unexpected turns. This was the Elena who existed beneath the uniform, and the practical concerns and the exhaustion. She looked at herself in the small mirror. With her hair down and the waitress uniform replaced by the dress, she looked different. Not just in appearance, but in the way she held herself, straighter with a dignity born of remembering rather than discovering something new. Taking a deep breath, Elena stepped out of the break room. It was time to transform from the person they laughed at to the person she had always been beneath the surface. The walk from the break room to the piano felt both endless and too quick. Elena was aware of the curious glances from her coworkers. Diane's raised eyebrows, Josh's confused expression, the kitchen staff peering through the service window. Rick had positioned himself near the bar, nervously watching her approach. She hadn't told him she was terrified, that her hands were trembling slightly, that she wasn't sure if her muscle memory would remain faithful after so many years. The black dress from Lost and Found wasn't fancy, just a simple shift dress that fell to her knees, but it was clean and fit well enough. She'd let her hair down from its tight bun, and it now fell in dark waves past her shoulders. Without the waitress uniform, she looked like a different person. She felt like a different person. As Elena approached the piano, several diners noticed her. Conversations paused briefly as people glanced her way, curious about this new development in their evening. The Harrington table fell silent as she passed, the woman in the crimson blazer whispering something to her neighbor. The piano bench was cool and smooth beneath her as she sat down. Elena adjusted her position, muscle memory from hundreds of practice sessions guiding her movements. She opened the lid and ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them, reacquainting herself with their feel. The ivory was smooth under her touch, like greeting an old friend. She was suddenly aware of the silence that had fallen over parts of the dining room. People were watching, waiting. The weight of their expectations pressed against her. What if she failed? What if years of disuse had stolen her skill? What if the laughter grew louder? Elena closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then another. She thought of Matteo, of how his eyes lit up when she played their small keyboard at home. She thought of her old teacher at the conservatory who had once told her, "Music isn't in the fingers, Elena. It's in the heart. The fingers just follow." Her fingers found their position hovering over the keys. And then, without further hesitation, she began to play. The first notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the restaurant. Gentle, dreamlike, the familiar melody flowed from her fingers as if no time had passed since she last performed it. There was a moment of uncertainty in the first few measures, her timing slightly off, but then something clicked into place. Her body remembered what her conscious mind had feared it had forgotten. She didn't look up, focused entirely on the music, but she could sense the shift in the restaurant. Conversations dropped to whispers, then faded entirely. The clink of silverware against plates grew less frequent. Even the kitchen seemed to quiet down. As the piece progressed, Elena felt herself relaxing into the music. The years fell away. She was no longer a waitress playing during an emergency. She was a musician sharing something precious. Her fingers moved with increasing confidence, drawing out the delicate emotions of the piece, the wistfulness, the quiet joy, the gentle melancholy. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, Elena opened her eyes, coming back to herself in the restaurant. For a moment, no one made a sound. Then, starting from somewhere near the back, applause broke out. It spread quickly, growing in volume until the entire dining room was filled with it. Elena looked up, startled by the response. Faces that had barely registered her existence an hour ago now looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to delight. At the bar, Rick was beaming, clapping enthusiastically. Diane stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her hands pressed to her mouth, eyes shining. The applause continued longer than Elena expected. When it finally began to fade, she took another deep breath and turned back to the piano. This time she chose Chopin, the nocturne in E-flat major that had been casually mentioned at the Harrington table. The piece began softly, almost tentatively, before building into flowing passages that required both technical precision and emotional depth. As she played, Elena allowed herself to glance around the room. The couple celebrating their anniversary held hands across their table, watching her with soft smiles. A family with teenage children had paused their meal entirely, their food forgotten as they listened. Even the kitchen staff had found excuses to emerge from behind the swinging doors, standing along the wall to watch her perform. And the Harrington table, Elena's eyes found them last. The laughter was gone from their faces. Mr. Harrington himself sat back in his chair, wine glass forgotten in his hand, his expression unreadable. The woman in the crimson blazer watched with narrowed eyes as if trying to reconcile the skilled musician before her with the waitress she had dismissed. The young man who had made the joke about the waitress entertaining them sat perfectly still, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment. Elena turned her attention back to the music, letting it flow through her, remembering why she had fallen in love with the piano in the first place. The nocturne reached its conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like a question before fading into silence. The applause this time was immediate and even more enthusiastic. Someone near the window let out a cheer. Elena felt a smile tugging at her lips, a real one, not the professional mask she wore during shifts. As the applause continued, Rick approached the piano. "That was incredible," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Would you play a few more pieces? The guests are loving it." Elena nodded, surprised by how much she wanted to continue. "I'd be happy to." For the next hour, Elena played a mixture of classical pieces and more contemporary compositions. She included Gershwin, recalling the comment from the Harrington table. She played a piece she had composed herself during her final year at the conservatory, a composition that had earned her high praise from instructors who rarely gave it. With each piece, she felt more of herself returning, parts she had carefully packed away to focus on survival and motherhood. It wasn't that she regretted the choices she had made. Matteo was the center of her world, but she had forgotten how it felt to be fully herself, to share this essential part of her identity with others. Between pieces, servers moved through the dining room, delivering food and clearing plates. The restaurant continued to function, but now with her music as its heartbeat. Elena noticed that Josh had returned to the Harrington table, and to her surprise they were treating him with new respect, their earlier rudeness apparently forgotten in the wake of her performance. During a brief pause, Diane appeared at her side with a glass of water. "You've been holding out on us," she said, her voice a mix of amazement and gentle accusation. "All this time," Elena took a grateful sip of water. "It's been a long time since I played like this. Why didn't you tell anyone?" Diane asked. Elena considered the question. It was easier not to talk about it, easier not to remember what I'd left behind. Diane squeezed her shoulder before returning to her section. As Elena turned back to the piano, she noticed a small crowd had gathered near the instrument. An elderly man approached her, leaning on a carved wooden cane. "Young lady," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "Would you happen to know any Schubert? My late wife and I danced to his impromptus at our wedding." Elena smiled. "Impromptu Opera 90, number 3? The old man's eyes lit up. "That's the one." Elena nodded and began to play the piece. As the familiar melody filled the air, she watched the elderly man close his eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm, lost in memories. This, she remembered, was the true power of music, its ability to transport, to heal, to connect people across time and experience. More requests followed. A young couple asked for Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. A woman celebrating her birthday requested a jazz standard. Elena played them all, reaching into her memory for pieces she hadn't thought about in years. 2 hours had passed and Elena hadn't once checked the time. The restaurant had reached that point in the evening when the rush was over, but lingering diners remained, savoring desserts and coffee. The atmosphere had transformed from the usual Friday night bustle to something more intimate, more connected. During a pause between songs, Elena noticed movement at the Harrington table. The silver-haired man himself was approaching the piano, his expression thoughtful. She steeled herself, unsure what to expect. "That was quite remarkable," Mr. Harrington said, his voice lacking the dismissive tone it had held earlier. "Where did you study?" "Westridge Conservatory," Elena replied. "For 3 years." His eyebrows lifted. "Westridge is highly selective. What happened after those 3 years?" The question wasn't asked unkindly, but it probed at decisions that were still tender when examined too closely. Elena chose her words carefully. "Life took a different turn than I had planned," she said simply. "I became a mother." Priorities shifted. Mr. Harrington nodded slowly, studying her with new interest. "You have exceptional talent. It would be a shame to see it confined to emergency situations when the regular pianist falls ill." He reached into his jacket and extracted a business card, placing it on the piano. "My foundation sponsors several music programs in the city. We're always looking for instructors with both skill and real-world perspective. If you're interested, give my office a call next week." Before Elena could respond, he had turned and walked back to his table. She looked down at the card, reading the embossed letters, "Harrington Foundation for the Arts." As the evening wound down, Elena played a final piece, a gentle, hopeful composition she had written years ago while pregnant with Matteo, imagining the future that might unfold for them both. As the last notes faded, the remaining diners applauded one more time. Several approached to thank her personally, pressing generous tips into her hands despite the fact that she hadn't served their tables. When the last guests had departed, Elena finally rose from the piano bench, her fingers tired but her spirit more awake than it had been in years. The staff gathered around her, full of questions and compliments. "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that? Where did you learn to play? Will you do this again?" Rick pushed through the group, his face serious but his eyes bright. "Elena, can I speak with you privately for a moment?" She followed him to the small office at the back of the restaurant, wondering if she was somehow in trouble despite the positive reception. Had she overstepped? Should she have remained invisible as expected? Rick closed the door and turned to face her, running a hand through his hair, a habit she recognized as a sign he was nervous. "Elena," he began, "I've worked in restaurants for 20 years. I've never seen anything like what happened tonight. You transformed the entire place." She waited, unsure where this was leading. "Our regular pianist, Paul, he's moving to Seattle next month. I was going to start interviewing replacements next week." Rick paused, then continued in a rush. "Would you consider taking the position? The pay is better than serving, and the hours would be more compatible with having a child." Elena felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. After what I saw tonight, I'd be crazy not to offer you the job." He named a figure that was nearly double what she made as a server. "And you could still pick up serving shifts if you wanted the extra income." The world seemed to tilt and resettle into a new configuration, one where possibilities she had long ago abandoned suddenly reappeared on the horizon.
One where the part of herself she had tucked away could breathe in the open air again. "I'd like some time to think about it," she said carefully,
though her heart was already racing with the possibilities. "Of course," Rick nodded. "Just let me know by Monday." As Elena changed back into her regular clothes in the break room, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked different somehow, as if something that had been dormant had awakened. The woman who had touched the piano had always been there, hiding beneath the practical concerns of everyday life. Tonight she had remembered who she was, and it seemed that everyone else had finally seen her too. The bus ride home that night felt different to Elena. The same worn seats, the same nighttime route she'd traveled hundreds of times, but everything had shifted. The world looked the same, but she viewed it through new eyes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Patel. "Matteo sleeping peacefully. No rush, hope your night went well." Elena smiled, typing back, "It went better than you could imagine. I'll tell you everything tomorrow. Thank you again." Her fingertips still tingled with the memory of the piano keys. For years, she had convinced herself that her music was part of a closed chapter in her life, a dream deferred by necessity and responsibility. Tonight had shattered that belief, revealing possibilities she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. When she quietly entered Mrs. Patel's apartment, the elderly woman was dozing in her armchair, a book open on her lap. She stirred as Elena gently closed the door. "You're glowing," Mrs. Patel observed, adjusting her glasses. "Good tips tonight?" Elena sat on the edge of the sofa where Mateo was fast asleep, a colorful blanket tucked around him. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead before turning to Mrs. Patel. "I played the piano tonight," she said, her voice soft but filled with wonder. "Their regular musician didn't show up, and I just decided to play." Mrs. Patel's eyes widened. In the 2 years they'd known each other, Elena had mentioned her musical background only in passing. "And?" the older woman prompted. "And it changed everything," Elena said simply. "The restaurant manager offered me a job as their regular pianist. Mr. Harrington, he runs an arts foundation, gave me his card. Said they're looking for instructors." She shook her head, still processing it all. "In one night, doors I thought were permanently closed have suddenly opened." Mrs. Patel smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes life waits for us to remember who we are before it shows us where we might go next." Elena gently lifted her sleeping son, cradling him against her shoulder. "I need to think about what this means for us, for our future." "You will make the right choice," Mrs. Patel said with quiet confidence. "You always do." The weekend passed in a blur of ordinary tasks transformed by extraordinary possibilities. Elena cleaned their apartment, did laundry, helped Mateo with his reading, all while her mind worked through what had happened and what might come next. On Saturday afternoon, she took Mateo to the small park near their apartment complex. As he played on the swings, she sat on a bench and made a list in a worn notebook, weighing options and practical considerations. Playing piano at Bellini's would mean better pay and more regular hours. No more late-night shifts, more time with Mateo in the evenings. But if something went wrong, if the arrangement didn't work out, would they let her return to serving? And what about the Harrington Foundation opportunity? Teaching music could provide stability, but would it be enough to support them both? "Mom, watch this!" Mateo called, pumping his legs on the swing, reaching higher than he ever had before. His face shone with the simple joy of childhood accomplishment. Elena tucked her notebook away and clapped for him, her heart full. Whatever she decided, it would be with him at the center of her considerations. Not just their financial security, but the example she set for him. What would it mean for him to see his mother reclaim this part of herself? On Sunday evening, after Mateo was asleep, Elena pulled out the small keyboard they kept in the corner of their living room. She sat cross-legged on the floor and began to play softly, letting her fingers reacquaint themselves with the feeling. It wasn't the same as the grand piano at Bellini's, but it carried the same essential truth. This was part of who she was, as fundamental as breathing. By Monday morning, her decision was made. When she called Rick to accept the pianist position, his relief was audible over the phone. "You're saving me from interviewing dozens of musicians with big egos and minimal talent," he joked. "Can you start this Friday?" "I can," she said, a smile in her voice. "But I'd like to keep one serving shift per week just to be safe." "Done," Rick agreed immediately. "And Elena, I'm really glad you're joining us in this new role." Her next call was to the number on Mr. Harrington's card. After being transferred twice, she found herself speaking with a woman named Grace who coordinated the Foundation's music education program. "Mr. Harrington mentioned you might call," Grace said warmly. "He was quite impressed with your performance. We're looking for part-time instructors for our after-school program. Would you be interested in coming in for an interview next week?" By the time Elena picked up Mateo from school that afternoon, the shape of their future had begun to transform, like a piece of music modulating from a minor key to a major one. "Same notes but entirely different feeling. Guess what, Mom?" Mateo said as they walked home, his small hand in hers. "Ms. Lee said I have a good ear for music. We're learning songs for the spring concert." Elena squeezed his hand. "That's wonderful. I have some news, too. Remember how I used to study piano before you were born?" Mateo nodded, kicking a stone along the sidewalk. "You showed me pictures once. You were wearing a fancy dress at the big theater." "That's right. Well, I'm going to be playing piano at the restaurant where I work, and I might be teaching piano to kids like you at a special program." Mateo stopped walking and looked up at her, his eyes wide. "Really, like for your job?" She nodded, watching his reaction carefully. A huge smile broke across his face. That's so cool. Can I come watch you play sometime? Absolutely, she promised. And guess what else? If everything works out, we might be able to save up for a real piano for our apartment, not just the keyboard, a real one. With the pedals and everything? His excitement was contagious. With everything, she confirmed. But it might take some time. That's okay, he said with the easy patience children sometimes surprise adults with. Good things are worth waiting for. That's what you always tell me. Friday arrived, and with it, Elena's debut as Bellini's official pianist. She had spent the week practicing on her keyboard, rebuilding calluses on her fingertips, and working through a mental catalog of pieces she could perform. Rick had given her free rein to choose her own repertoire, trusting her judgment after what he had witnessed the previous week. This time, she arrived at the restaurant not through the staff entrance but through the front door. She wore a simple black dress she had found at a second-hand store, more elegant than the lost and found dress but still affordable on her budget. Her hair was styled simply but intentionally, and she carried a folder of sheet music under her arm. Diane was the first to spot her from behind the host station. "Look at you," she exclaimed, coming around to embrace Elena. "Our star performer." Other staff members greeted her with a mix of their usual casual friendliness and a new respect. Josh gave her a thumbs up from across the dining room. The chef emerged briefly from the kitchen to welcome her with a nod and a rare smile. As Elena settled at the piano, adjusting the bench to her preferred height, she felt a strange dual awareness. This was both entirely new and deeply familiar. Her fingers found the keys, and she began with a gentle piece to accompany the early diners just beginning their meals. Throughout the evening, she moved between classical pieces, jazz standards, and contemporary compositions, reading the room and matching the music to the atmosphere as it evolved. During breaks, she circulated through the restaurant, speaking with guests who were curious about the music, or who had requests. The most surprising moment came midway through the evening when the front door opened and Mrs. Patel entered with Matteo. Elena had arranged for them to come for dessert, but seeing them actually there, Matteo in his best shirt, his hair carefully combed, Mrs. Patel beaming proudly, made her heart swell. Rick seated them at a small table near the piano, and Elena watched as Matteo's eyes grew wide, taking in the grand piano, the elegant restaurant, and his mother at the center of it all. When she began her next piece, a playful Mozart sonata she knew he enjoyed, she played it looking directly at him, and the smile that broke across his face was worth every difficult moment of the past 5 years. Later, as Matteo savored a chocolate cake that the chef had insisted on providing on the house, several patrons stopped by their table. "Your mother is very talented," one woman told Matteo. "You must be so proud." "I am," he agreed, chocolate smeared at the corner of his mouth. "She's teaching me to play too." The news spread quickly through the restaurant's regular clientele and staff. The skilled pianist had once been their waitress, hidden in plain sight. People who had barely noticed her for years now requested favorite songs and left generous tips in the jar Rick had placed on the piano. Word traveled beyond the restaurant's walls as well. A local food blogger mentioned the incredible pianist with a fascinating backstory in a review of Bellini's. A music professor from the community college came to hear her after a colleague mentioned the restaurant's new talent. 2 weeks into her new role, Elena received an invitation to perform at a charity event hosted by the Harrington Foundation. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't the external recognition or opportunities. It was what happened within Elena herself. Each night as she played, she reclaimed pieces of her identity that had been set aside but never truly lost. The discipline of daily practice returned to her life, bringing with it the meditative focus she had once relied on. The creative impulse that had been channeled into finding ways to stretch their budget now found expression in music again. She began composing in the quiet hours after Matteo went to bed, something she hadn't done since before his birth. The interview at the Harrington Foundation had gone well, and Elena now spent Tuesday and Thursday afternoons teaching piano to children from underserved neighborhoods. Many of them reminded her of herself at their age, raw talent without access to opportunities. She approached them with a patience and understanding born from her own interrupted journey, knowing firsthand that the path to mastery was rarely straight or simple. 1 month after her first official performance at Bellini's, Elena sat at the piano during a quiet moment between dinner and the late evening crowd. Her fingers moved through a piece she was composing, something new that captured the feeling of rediscovery, of finding your way back to yourself. Rick approached, leaning against the piano with an expression of satisfaction. "You've transformed this place," he said simply. "Reservations are up 30%. People are requesting tables specifically on nights when you play." "I'm glad," Elena replied, genuinely happy to have contributed to the restaurant's success. Many of the staff had become like family over the years. "The thing is," Rick continued, "I've been thinking about what happened that night. How you just sat down and changed everything. It makes me wonder how many other people we pass every day without knowing their full story. How many hidden talents and abandoned dreams are just waiting for the right moment." Elena nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. She had been one of those people, defined by her uniform, her role, the narrow slice of herself she presented to the world. How many others were there, carrying dormant gifts within them? "The right moment," she echoed, her fingers finding a gentle chord. "And sometimes the courage to create that moment for yourself." As the restaurant began to fill again for the later seating, Elena started a new piece, something hopeful and inviting. She caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of the piano, a woman transformed not by becoming someone new, but by remembering who she had always been. 6 months had passed since that fateful Friday night when Elena first sat down at Bellini's piano. The seasons had changed, summer heat giving way to autumn crispness, trees in the city park now dressed in gold and crimson. Life had transformed just as dramatically for Elena and Matteo. Their apartment was still the same small 2-bedroom in the same building, but inside, the changes were unmistakable. In the corner of the living room stood a used upright piano. Not a grand like the one at Bellini's, but a real piano with warm tone and responsive action. They had found it through one of Elena's students, an elderly man who could no longer play due to arthritis and wanted his beloved instrument to go to someone who would cherish it. Matteo practiced on it every afternoon, his small fingers growing more confident on the keys each week. Elena had begun teaching him properly, watching with quiet joy as he developed the same love for music that had shaped her own life. The walls now held framed programs from Elena's performances, not just her regular nights at Bellini's, but small concerts at local venues, community events, and most prominently, the charity gala held by the Harrington Foundation 3 months earlier. That evening had marked a turning point in her re-emergence as a musician. Dressed in a midnight blue gown borrowed from Grace at the foundation, Elena had performed for an audience that included some of the city's most influential arts patrons. Her program had included classical pieces alongside 2 of her own compositions, works that told her story without words. The journey of loss and rediscovery translated into music that had moved many in the audience to tears. This morning, Elena sat at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reviewing the final details for today's event. The theater at the community college was small, just 200 seats, but it represented something enormous, her first solo recital since leaving the conservatory. "Mom?" Matteo padded into the kitchen in pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep. "Are you nervous about today?" Elena smiled, pulling out a chair for him. "A little," she admitted, pouring him a glass of orange juice. "It's been a long time since I gave a full recital." "You'll be amazing," he said with absolute certainty, the kind only children can muster. "I've heard you practicing. It sounds perfect." "Nothing's ever perfect," she reminded him gently, "but that's what makes it human. The little imperfections are part of what makes music special." He considered this as he munched on the toast she placed before him. "Like when you tell me not to worry about missing some notes as long as I keep going." "Exactly like that," she nodded. "The most important thing is to keep playing, to tell the story the music is trying to share." As Matteo finished his breakfast, Elena checked her phone. A text from Diane. "The restaurant crew has tickets for the second row. We're all coming to cheer you on." Another from Mrs. Patel. "The dress looks beautiful, dear. I've pressed it and hung it on your bedroom door. We'll pick up Matteo at noon as planned." The support that had materialized around her over these months still amazed Elena. People she had worked alongside for years without truly knowing now showed up in her life in ways she hadn't expected. Rick had rearranged the restaurant schedule to ensure everyone who wanted to attend her recital could do so. The chef had prepared a special meal for her pre-concert dinner the night before. Even the Harrington Foundation had purchased a block of tickets to distribute to her students and their families. The morning passed quickly in final preparations. Elena reviewed her program once more, mentally walking through each piece. She practiced a particularly challenging passage from the Rachmaninoff, her fingers dancing over the kitchen counter as Mateo watched with fascination. "That's so fast," he observed. "How do you remember where all the notes go?" "Years of practice," she told him, "and sometimes I still forget. But it's in my muscles now, not just my head. My fingers remember even when my brain gets confused." At noon, Mrs. Patel arrived to take Mateo for the afternoon. They would come to the theater together later. Mateo proudly wearing his first real dress shirt and tie for the occasion. "You look distracted," Mrs. Patel noted as Elena gave her some last-minute instructions about Mateo's schedule. "Just going over everything in my mind," Elena admitted. The older woman clasped her hands. "Stop thinking so much. Music comes from here." She patted her chest over her heart. "Not here." She tapped her forehead. "You've done all the preparation. Now let your heart speak." Left alone in the quiet apartment, Elena moved to the piano. Not to practice, she had done enough of that, but to center herself. She placed her hands on the keys without pressing them, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, and closed her eyes. 6 months ago, she had been a different person, or rather a diminished version of herself, working double shifts, constantly calculating how to stretch their limited income, setting her own dreams aside to ensure Mateo had what he needed. She didn't regret those choices. They had been necessary at the time. But now she understood that by reclaiming her own passion, she gave her son something equally important, the example of a parent living authentically, with purpose and joy. Her phone buzzed with another text message, this one from a number she didn't immediately recognize. "Good luck today. The staff still talks about the night you first played for us. James Harrington." It took her a moment to place the name. Mr. Harrington, the silver-haired man whose table had laughed at the idea of a waitress playing the piano. He had become one of her most steadfast supporters through his foundation, though she rarely saw him personally. The hours passed, and soon it was time to leave for the theater. Elena dressed carefully in the midnight blue gown Mrs. Patel had pressed for her, the same one from the foundation gala, now purchased rather than borrowed after her first month of combined income from Bellini's, and teaching had allowed for the splurge. The community college theater was modest by professional standards, but as Elena peeked through the curtain 30 minutes before her recital, her heart quickened at the sight of seats filling with people. She recognized many faces, her students and their families. The Bellini staff clustered together in their promised second-row seats, Mrs. Patel and Mateo being escorted to front-row seats reserved especially for them. In the green room, she warmed up her fingers with silent exercises, maintaining the focus she would need for the next 90 minutes. A gentle knock at the door revealed Grace from the foundation. "Everyone's so excited," Grace told her, adjusting a loose pin in Elena's hair. "We've sold out completely. Even added a few extra seats in the back." "I never expected this many people," Elena confessed. 6 months ago I was anonymous, just another person in the background of other people's evenings." Grace smiled. "People respond to authenticity. Your story, your music. They remind us that it's never too late to become who we're meant to be." When the house lights dimmed and Elena walked onto the stage, the applause that greeted her was warm and enthusiastic. She spotted Mateo first, sitting up straight in his new shirt, his face shining with pride. Behind him sat the restaurant crew, Diane, Josh, Rick, and even the chef who had apparently left the kitchen in someone else's hands for the evening. Elena settled at the piano, adjusted the bench, and took a moment to collect herself before beginning. The program she had chosen told the story of her journey, beginning with pieces that reflected struggle and constraint, moving through works that spoke of hope and possibility, and concluding with her own compositions that celebrated renewal and joy. As she played the first notes of Bach's Prelude in C minor, the theater disappeared. There was only the music flowing from her heart through her hands, sharing pieces of her soul with everyone present. The technical elements she had worried over fell into place, not with mechanical perfection, but with honest emotion. Between pieces, she spoke briefly to the audience, sharing context about the music and glimpses of her story. Not the full details, those remained private, but enough that they understood the narrative arc of her program, the rebirth she was celebrating through this recital. When she reached her own compositions in the final segment of the program, Elena felt a different kind of vulnerability. These weren't the works of famous composers that had been performed countless times. These were her own musical thoughts, personal and unguarded. The first piece, titled simply Waiting, captured the quiet longing of years spent putting dreams on hold. The second, Recognition, explored the moment of remembering one's true self after a long absence. The final piece was called Matteo's Song, written for and inspired by her son. As she played it, Elena looked directly at him in the front row. The composition moved from playful opening themes reflecting childhood through more complex middle passages suggesting growth and discovery, before concluding with a hopeful, open-ended phrase that pointed toward a future still being written. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience rose to their feet, applause washing over her like a wave. Elena stood, moved to the front of the stage and bowed, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. After 2 curtain calls, she gestured to Matteo to join her on stage. Initially shy, he needed Mrs. Patel's gentle encouragement before walking up the side steps to stand beside his mother. Elena knelt to his level and whispered in his ear. He nodded, suddenly serious, and together they walked to the piano. This hadn't been part of the planned program, but felt right in the moment. They sat side by side on the bench and began a simple duet they had been practicing at home, Elena playing the complex bass line while Matteo handled the straightforward melody. His small fingers moved carefully but confidently, and though he missed a few notes, he kept going just as she had taught him, telling the story without getting lost in the mistakes. When they finished, the audience's response was even more enthusiastic than before. Matteo beamed as he took a bow, holding his mother's hand tightly. Backstage after the recital, Elena's green room filled with well-wishers, students, colleagues, friends new and old. Rick presented her with a huge bouquet from the Bellini's staff. Mrs. Patel pressed a small, wrapped package into her hands, a vintage metronome that had belonged to her late husband, himself a music teacher. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd thinned, Mr. Harrington appeared in the doorway with a distinguished-looking woman beside him. "Magnificent performance," he said, shaking Elena's hand. "I'd like you to meet Diane Winters, the new director of our City Symphony's community outreach program. She's very interested in discussing some possibilities with you." As they talked about potential collaborations and programs, Elena felt Matteo lean against her side, tired, but happy. She wrapped her arm around him, anchoring herself in the present moment even as new doors continued to open before her. Later that night, after the excitement had faded and Matteo was asleep, Elena sat alone at their piano in the quiet apartment. She played softly, improvising rather than rehearsing, letting the music follow her thoughts. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. There would be new challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But she had rediscovered an essential truth. We are more than our circumstances, more than the roles we play for others. Sometimes the person others laugh at or overlook carries within them music powerful enough to transform not just a room, but an entire life. Elena's fingers found a final, peaceful chord that hung in the air like a promise. Then she closed the piano, ready to rest before tomorrow's new beginning.